Okay. So good morning. Today is February 25th. I'm Scott Forcino with an associate broker at Real Brokerage, LLC, based in Manhattan, New York. I have Scott Einbinder with me, a career professional, visionary, trainer, and speaker, and real estate strategist. We are now going to explain, Scott will give us his insight, how to be a buyer's agent in this new policy environment, as Scott calls it. There are others in the series, how to be a better listing agent in this environment, and how to be a lender and title company and home inspector to work with your preferred realtor referral partners. So Scott, good morning. What
Good
are your
morning.
thoughts?
Thank you.
This is after this settlement and the implementation of the new policy.
Well, I think the first way you have to think about it, and I think it's always important to look at things from the consumer lens, right? We tend to look at things from our industry lens, but it's really, really important to have that perspective. And so, from the buyer side of the equation, I think it is a positive, right? It gives buyers a much greater level of transparency in terms of the process. I mean, we all know the way in which buyers would buy homes and work with buyer's agents, where the interaction between the buyer and the buyer agent was a process of, showing the home, getting access to the property, strategizing on, offers and giving information and navigating all the transactional issues, being there for the inspection, making inspection recommendations. I mean, we know all the typical, what I call basic buyer expectations from the agent. But what this new policy environment did was it unpacked compensation for the buyer, which was never really done. Buyers often had the expectation that their buyer agent was working for free. I mean, again, it's semantics, but buyers were not exposed to the compensation that their buyer agent was getting in many cases until the closing table. So buyers really didn't understand the value proposition when it comes to compensation with their agent. So what this new policy environment did for the buyer was to disclose now certain things regarding compensation, but also bring in other elements into the relationship that were, again, in many cases, not really even understood by the buyer. And it's pretty much four major components. The first component, obviously, is compensation, which we'll talk about. The second component is whether or not that relationship is exclusive or non-exclusive, which we'll discuss. The third is the services, a list of the services that the buyer agent will be delivering to the buyer. And fourth, region or geographic location. Where does this buyer agency agreement take effect? Is it within a particular county, in a particular region, a municipality? It could be, one home, several homes. So the idea is that this buyer relationship between the realtor has opened up, in my view, a very, very good thing for buyers with respect to disclosure, clarity, understanding, and expectation.
And now that we're speaking directly to buyers agents in this video, the point is, let us know how you think buyer's agent can be successful in, of course, following the rules.
Yeah.
Seller's advocacy, representation, negotiation, how to get the agreement signed, demonstrate their value. I mean,
so you threw a lot there. So I think the first thing is, I think to be a buyer's agent, whether it was pre-policy or post-policy, is you really need to be an expert in your craft. You need to be an expert when it comes to data, when it comes to the marketplace, really understanding inventory. There's, a lot of buyer agents, they don't really have a handle around inventory. They don't preview properties enough. They don't learn enough about all the homes that are available. I mean, one of the best activities that a buyer agent can do when it comes to becoming smarter and more knowledgeable with respect to their inventories, they should be previewing on a daily basis, previewing the existing inventory, previewing expired inventory, previewing closed. I mean, anything that they can do to become more acclimated to houses and what's happening. In addition, there's tremendous data out there. I mean, RPR, which is a realtor tool that's available to realtors. There's a tremendous amount of data in there. So there's endless amounts of reports. So I think it starts with becoming an absolute expert with respect to data and with respect to inventory knowledge and understanding. That goes without question. But I think the next thing to make a buyer agent effective and successful is to really understand what the consumers are looking for, right? And there's two things that I talk about. It's what is your expected value, and then what is your value added benefit. These are two different things that a buyer agent needs to be able to articulate to a buyer. And I'll repeat that. There are basic services, I call those core services, which is what buyers expect of, quite frankly, any agent. And for example, one of the things that they expect is they expect their agent to be an expert. They expect their agent to know inventory. They expect their agent to know the market. They expect their agent to know the process. So all of those things. In addition to that, all of those things we talk about in terms of being responsive and honest and reliable, those are all characteristics. Again, these are not special characteristics. These are characteristics that the consumer expects of their agent. So you can't sell that as what we call the value added benefit. So all of those, so an agent needs to understand their basic core value proposition. Again, services that consumers expect of you. And then each buyer agent needs to build their own, what I call value added benefit. These are things that consumers may not be expecting of their buyer agent, but these are services that are delivered. So these are things that go beyond the, let's call it the four corners of expectation, and bring in, all other elements. And this is where buyer agents can be creative and have ingenuity and have differentiation and all those things. Because let's face it, if we stacked 10 buyer agents up next to each other and we asked each one of them, what's their value proposition? In many cases, those answers sound identical. And they are identical if you're offering those basic core services. But if you want to be effective and to really be impactful, you've got to create that, what I call that special value added benefit, which again are things that people don't expect from you.
I see. Well, you mentioned data, and how do you reconcile that with buyers almost universally are finding their own homes or finding homes they'd like to see? I mean, they're might be working with 5 or 10 buyers at any point, and these buyers are midnight on the iPad looking on stuff, and the realtor going to be fed those information.
Right. So the buyer, yes, in many cases they do find the home, but then what are all the elements around that home? Every home has a history, right? Every home has, unless it's new construction, which that might even have a history too, but there's a history of each home, and each home sits within a community. There's a lot of variables about that. And when I say about the home, there are pricing considerations and non-pricing considerations. So features, close to transportation, all those things that, the public can get a lot of that on their own too. But there are dynamics about the community, about the, just the logistics of how things are within a community. That's one thing. So finding about the house, but there's also the financial aspect, meaning that where does that pricing history evolve? Not only with that house, but maybe within that market, and really sharing with buyers kind of, again, historical pricing trends within a particular area. I think that that's an important thing. And there's a lot of elements to that, relative to square footage and condition and age. So that's really where an agent's expertise comes into play with respect to data.
I see. Well, now that would you describe maybe some of the circumstances, and I'd be the buyer. Scott Einbinder, I understand you're a top pro in your market. I've been reading or watching 60 Minutes that I have to sign this document now. I never did this before.
Right.
Am I you? And what do you say when this is happening? As we know, and can I go to the listing?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the protocol now is, as we said earlier, when a buyer and a buyer agent are going to engage with each other, it can't just be some verbal conversation back and forth regarding those four elements that we discussed, right? There's got to now be an agreement. So the nice part about it from the consumer's lens is that now things are going to be reduced to writing, right? And with respect to those four elements, and in most cases, if a buyer now wants to see a property, they simply want to go visit a property with a buyer agent. The buyer agent, unlike prior to this policy change, could just take them to the house and show it to them. But now they have to sit down and have them sign a written agreement before they go see that house. And they have to get that, the buyer has to agree to those four conditions before they actually go out and see the home. Now, just keep in mind, the buyer agency agreement is not a new agreement. It existed in many states for many years. So the versions of this buyer agreement already exist. Agents have been using buyer's agreements for many years in many states. The difference between the pre-dated buyer agreement and today's buyer agreement has largely to do with compensation and the understanding of compensation and who's going to pay the compensation and all those things that were never really transparent to the buyer prior, now is transparent to the buyer.
That makes sense. And if what should a competent aspiring buyer's agent say to a buyer who would call them on a lead or wanted to see a property?
Yeah. So the first thing that the buyer agent should do is to alert the buyer that there's a new policy, right? Some buyers may not even know it. A lot of buyers don't even realize it. I mean, we are now, 6-7 months into this new environment, and there's still a lot of buyers that don't really know what's going on. They've heard something on the news, everyone's heard something, but nobody really understands it to a certain degree. So the first thing a buyer agent should do is to alert them that there's a new policy, there's a new way of doing business, there's a new thing that's involved, and share them. This is a great thing for you, and share all the, and you'd love to meet with them, tell them that there's a benefit in meeting with a realtor upfront to go through these things. So this way they know what they're getting into before they go see a property with a realtor. And by the way, it works on the other side too. The realtor might determine that this buyer may not meet their, again, these are independent contractors. They can decide, maybe the buyer's too demanding or whatever. So it's kind of like a dual benefit, the way I see it. So the buyer agent should just alert them that there's a new way of doing things. This is the right way to do it. Before you go out and run around and see a house, we need to sit down. Let me go through with you all the services that I offer, both the core services, the non-core services, the things that you should expect from everybody, the things that I do that are different. And then you unpack the compensation and all the things associated with that. When it comes to money, buyers are going to want to know what the deal is. So it's not that hard to get them to meet and agree.
Well, we know that the commissions we're not violating any federal law here. Usually offer 2.5% out, and that would on $1 million be $20,000 to $25,000, and you could extrapolate half that is $10,000 to $12,500. So that's really kind of where we are in America. A lot of things are in the 3s or up to the 6s, maybe across this country. So how would a realtor explain that the sum that was not paid before outright over, out of pocket, I should say, not financed?
Yeah.
How can, is there, is there an hourly benefit? Do they talk about their history, their expertise, their negotiating skills, their command of the law, their command of relationships? Maybe they're a top dog in the area and they get their offers accepted. Who knows?
So first off, with respect to it's a pretty easy conversation with a buyer with respect to compensation. I mean, basically, here's the simplistic way to explain it. It used to be, and this would be a buyer agent telling a buyer, it used to be that realtors shared commissions. That was the business. It was a sharing kind of environment. A listing agent would negotiate compensation not only for themselves, but the listing agent would negotiate the compensation for the buyer's agent, right? So the compensation negotiation always happened with the listing agent on behalf of the buyer's agent. And you got to think about that. I mean, if I'm a buyer's agent and I am, let's say, not worth a percentage, but some listing agent is able to negotiate that for me, that's kind of the way it works. So the idea is that buyer agent compensation was generally negotiated by a listing agent. So the way you explain it to a buyer is to say, listen, under the new policy environment, the good news is that you as the buyer now have really more understanding of the compensation, right? And realtors no longer really share commissions. The way it works now is that if you would choose me to represent you, if you think I'm a good solution to you to work with, I have to now disclose to you what I charge. And you as the buyer will determine if I am worth that charge. So from the buyer's perspective, rather now not knowing what your agent is getting, you know what your agent is asking for from you before you even start your journey. And the buyer agent, that's why a buyer agent has to be very good at explaining their value proposition, both things that they expect, the buyers expect, and things that they don't. You got to be worth it. So that is the manner in which the buyer agent can engage the buyer in this conversation. Now, when it comes time to sit down with that buyer and go through the compensation, there's something called the manner of payment of the compensation, because under the new policy situation here, a buyer agent can be paid in a couple of different ways, meaning that the manner of payment, so the buyer themselves can write out the entire buyer agent commission from their own proceeds, their own liquid proceeds, just like how they write the check for down payment. Let's say in this case, they're writing the check for the closing costs, they would write the check for the buyer agent commission. That's one way they can get paid. The other way the buyer agent can be paid is they could ask the seller to pay that commission. So kind of just like it was prior to the new policy procedure, the seller still has the option of offering compensation directly to a buyer agent. So let's understand what we're asking for. We're asking for the buyer agent, right? We're asking the buyer agent who's there working for the buyer. They're negotiating for the buyer. They're kind of working with the buyer in their interests. We're asking the seller to pay for that service.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're asking for. That's the other option. And sellers now, and that's a conversation on the seller side, but sellers now will determine whether or not they want to or not want to. And then the third option is it could be a combination of both. The seller can pay some of that commission. The buyer could pay some of it. So let's just say we had a hypothetical 2% buyer agent commission that the buyer agent was asking for from the buyer. Well, the manner of payment could be 1% coming from the buyer and 1% coming from the seller, if the seller is willing to agree to pay that. So that's the way in which the buyer agent should unpack the conversation with regarding compensation. The spirit of it is to give full disclosure, full transparency, so the buyer has absolutely full knowledge of what they are getting into before they even start their journey to look at the home. So that's the specificity with respect to the compensation, right? And again, it kind of makes sense from the consumer's perspective.
Well, you mentioned one of the ways for the buyer's agent to be compensated is to request that from the seller. Well,
yes.
How is that request made, and where is that?
So there's two ways in which that request can be made. The first way, it would be just direct. So if, let's say, there was a listing on the market for $500,000 and the buyer agent was charging the buyer a 2% commission of, for $10,000, it would just be a direct request. We would submit the offer, the buyer agent would submit the offer, and inside of that offer, they would be requesting that the seller pay $10,000, just like any other expense. Now, whether or not that offer of the compensation was below the list price, above the list, it doesn't really matter. The point is that it would just be a direct request coming out of the seller's net proceeds. The other way in which the compensation can be kind of arranged is inside of a seller concession, which is, again, it's a seller concession. This is money that the seller is contributing towards the buyer's closing costs. And we're in an environment right now where some lenders are allowing that compensation to be included in a seller concession, and some lenders are not. There's been some confusion. I mean, it's not confusing, but Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac kind of sent out a memo stating that the buyer agency compensation is not what they note as an interested party contribution. So technically, it's not a financeable cost, but we're kind of in the red zone here, and we're seeing some lenders are just not unpacking the commission out of the transaction. Some are, but not to confuse anyone, it's still it's part of the process right now. But keep in mind, if the buyer is paying or arranging for that buyer commission to be inside of a seller concession, it's still being paid. I mean, it's being paid. It's being financed theoretically. So in essence, it's not like the buyer isn't paying it. It's like kind of when you go buy a car, right? And they sell you all those aftermarket products and they just keep adding it to the loan amount, right? It's not free. You're not getting it for nothing. I mean, in fact, not only are you paying an extra $1,000 for that clear coat wax, over time you're paying $3,000. So there's no free ride with respect to the buyer compensation if it's in a concession. In fact, in many cases, it could be much more over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, you make a nice distinction. I'm glad you did, because I guess a piece of your instruction is that the request for compensation must be made only within an offer, which means there is
right.
We call canvassing, a realtor representing a buyer calling around to try to find the fish that is going to offer compensation.
Well, yeah. Well, what you're referring to is a lot of agents, and again, it's new, but if you're a buyer's agent and you're basing your compensation with your buyer based on what a seller's going to pay you, that really goes against the spirit of what this whole thing's about. Your compensation isn't to be determined by what a seller will pay. Your compensation is to be determined by what a buyer thinks you're worth, and that's the major distinction. That if you're moving ahead with a buyer and you get to this compensation and you say, well, I charge, a commission of, 2%, but if a seller's gonna, only pay me 1%. You got to come up with the difference. Now that's okay. You can do that, but you can't leave it blank. You can't say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I'd like to charge 2, but we're going to sit and wait and see what a seller will pay. If the seller will give me 3, I'll get 3. If the seller will give me whatever, it's not meant to wait. You're not supposed to rely upon what a seller's offering. You're supposed to clear the deck on that up front. And one of the rules of the new policy is that once you commit to a number with a buyer, you can't collect any more than that, which again, from a consumer's perspective is good, right? If you and the buyer agree to a 2% compensation and you come across a transaction where the seller is offering to pay the buyer agent 3%, well, that buyer agent is capped at the 2%. You can't rip up the agreement or erase it and put in the 3. That again, it goes against what the new policies are. So from the consumer's perspective and from the buyer's perspective, it's all vetted up front. That's the way it should be done. Now, is it being done right now that way by everybody? I would make the argument in many cases it's not, but the needle is moving and buyers are getting more acclimated to the way it's doing. There's a lot of information out there. Maybe videos like this will help educate them. So a good buyer agent needs to educate their buyer on what the rules are. And more importantly, they've got to come up with their value proposition to make it worth it.
Well, what are some examples? I mean, Scott, I'm looking at this property, and I know you're a top pro, but I mean, that's really that's not a cost I anticipated. How am I better served by working with you, the listing agent? I mean,
so
that's what we're going to face.
Gotcha. So again, just to kind of review, what these basic services are. And I think if you're a buyer's agent, I'm going to run through some of the things that are what I consider to be expected value. Make the appointment to preview the house. Prepare comparables that you can give the buyer to. Obviously, show the property. Inquire and answer any of the buyer's questions. Submit the offer. Strategize on how you're going to submit the offer. Negotiate the transaction on behalf of the buyer, right? Go through the negotiation process. Act as a liaison between the listing agent and yourself. You're this buffer between the two. And manage the transaction successfully to closing, handling all of the issues and problems that come up along the way. That's basically, and again, there's 1,000 things there, but those are the broad strokes. This is what a buyer agent does. Now, the challenge is, what's the difference, right? Like, what if I'm a buyer? What's the difference between a good negotiator and not a good negotiator? And all of we hear a lot about that, but remember, a lot has to do with inventory availability. There's a many dynamics. When one calls themselves a great negotiator, it's not a static environment. If you have a seller who needs money or who's very resistant, your negotiating skills may not have much of an impact. If you have a very limited inventory environment, there are some realtors who are great negotiators, but their buyers end up buying the house $100,000 over asking price. Now, that might be good, but a lot of one's negotiation skills as a buyer's agent are very connected and dependent upon what is the circumstance on that subject property. And that's just a fact. You just can't deny that. But again, you're trying to sell something where you just don't know what the outcome is going to look like, right? It's like saying, listen, we're going to sell you a car that's really, really good on bumpy roads, but how bumpy? How big are the bumps? Are bumps going to just emerge? There's so many. But all those things that I just mentioned are, part of the basic package. And from a buyer's agent, you're going to put them in front of a buyer. You're going to explain those elements. And, that's going to be, in my view, part one of your buyer presentation to a buyer. And again, inside that, as far as what I call the non, the non-transactional things, like your personality, your likability, the ease to talk to you, how you make people feel comfortable. All those things matter as well. And, people buy people first, and then they buy the services. But, from a buyer's agent perspective, if it's you versus another buyer agent, and you both have good personalities, and you're both likable, and you're both easy to talk to, then it's going to come down to, well, what are your features? What are your features and benefits, right? And you have to sell those features and benefits to win that buyer. Because remember, this is the different lay of the land. Because before you go put them in the back of your car or meet them at the property, they have to have already agreed to buy you. And that's the difference in our business now. Buyers have to now buy the realtor first, and then they go and start their pursuit of going and buying a property. It's a cataclysmic difference between the way it was done. Some people say nothing has changed. Everything has changed.
I'm in full agreement. Everything's changed because the two automatics that you just described, where a buyer's agent wakes up and has income waiting for them, now it has to be secured. There has to be a sale. Someone has to believe in your abilities and your zealous representation. And also a key part now, I think, is really playing by the rules. So we just touched upon what I call canvassing. I heard that's the description of calling around on behalf of a buyer to relieve.
That's really the only way you're going to be. If you're a buyer's agent right now, let's face it. The real spirit of this litigation or change of policy is, once you've secured your commission with your buyer, there should be no calling around as to what's your commission. Like,
exactly.
To really understand it, what the seller is willing to pay has nothing to do with your compensation conversation with your buyer. It shouldn't. And we'll get to that place in time. We're not there yet. But when you really think about it, if the buyer has agreed to pay you a 2% commission out of their own pocket, if that's what's been secured, and the buyer signs that agreement and you're locked in, go show them houses. It shouldn't even be, hey, what's your seller offering? Now, the reason why we're in that environment right now, Scott, is because sellers who list their properties with realtors, they're still being told, and it's true, that they can offer compensation out to a buyer's agent. So we're still in an environment where that can exist. But the difference is there's no advertising those commissions. You can't put that offer in the MLS. You can't advertise it. You have to, the only way for a buyer agent to even know if there's any commission being paid for by the seller is you got to pick up the phone and make a phone call.
But that phone call only has to come if someone has seen the property, they've essentially gone naked, they have incurred liability. Buyers owes buyer's agent money if the sale goes through. So it's really that's the risk that has to be addressed. When you make an offer, you don't know on behalf of the buyer, you don't know if the seller's agent is going to say yes. So if they say no,
Right.
are you buying the house?
Well, that's why the guidance that I've given buyer's agents when they're working with buyers is that if you get the buyer to sign the agreement and the buyer, and we talked about that manner of payment, and the buyer says, listen, if you can get your fee from the seller, do it. If you can get the seller to pay your commission, buyer's agent, do it. But I'm not going to pay it out of my own pocket. Now, if a buyer agent moves forward with a buyer with that understanding that the compensation is going to be coming from the seller and not from the buyer, that's where I believe the problem is, right? Buyer agents are moving ahead at a risk, because what they're doing is these buyers are like, okay, if you can get it from the seller, get it from the seller. If I can, pack it into my financing, great. It's only going to be, $30 a month, whatever it comes down to. But if the seller says no, and the seller doesn't want to pay the compensation, now the buyer agent has a real problem. And we haven't seen the outcome of this yet. What happens when a buyer agent gets a buyer to sign an agreement where the understanding is it's going to come from the seller? The buyer did not expressly state that they will write the check out of their own pocket. They submit the offer and the seller comes back and says, we accept the offer, but we're not going to give any compensation. I mean, what is the buyer agent going to do? It's going to be a real dilemma. We haven't seen yet litigation from this. We haven't seen the buyer agent then go to the buyer and say, well, you better find the money, buyer, or I'm going to sue you, or you better find the money, buyer, or you can't buy this house. I mean, we haven't seen that yet. I think there's a lot of questions as to the practicality of what's going to happen there. That's why my guidance to buyer agents is that if you're going to move ahead with a buyer and a buyer does not have your commission in their own bank account, if they haven't reconciled the fact that if they can't get it from the seller, that they will pay you. If you move ahead with that buyer without that clarity, I think you're moving at risk. I think that buyer agents should work with buyers who have the commission liquid and ready to give if they can't get it from the seller.
I completely agree, and you're not saying anything that's novel. That's what the contracts state. That's so I don't know why they're being, unless people
no. In some cases, it doesn't state it. It just says the buyer's commission is X. It does not unpack the manner of payment. That's the confusion. If there is not, so I know buyer agents who in many cases are adding to the buyer agreement. They're saying, listen, the commission's 2%. We're going to try to get it from the seller, but if I can't, you're going to pay me the commission out of your own proceeds. And the buyer agent, if they're a good buyer's agent, they will do their due diligence to make sure that the buyer has that compensation. And just like a good realtor won't be running around with a buyer who is not pre-approved for a mortgage or pre-qualified, you should make sure that your buyer is pre-approved to pay it. Because if, let's say, a buyer agrees to pay you that compensation, right? They say, oh, okay, I'll give it out of the bank account. I have it. And their lender hasn't verified that that money is properly sourced or isn't going to have an impact on their financing. You might be right back to square one again. So I think it's really important that buyer agents do their due diligence on the money up front before they even show the house. That's just the smart way to do it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you've also mentioned to me that there may be a movement from the percentage-based compensation? One, two, four. It may be hourly. It may be a lump sum. It may be a la carte. I mean, what are your thoughts? Should agents speak to their brokers and introduce the concept of an alternate form of payment?
You're going to see it across the board. First thing you're going to see is you're going to see competition amongst buyer commissions, right? Because once we get into a place where buyers understand that it's, money out of their pocket, they might start shopping on. Remember, if I was a buyer's agent prior, I never had a conversation about compensation on my end. So buyers never really went down this road. But now, if it's being done right, and a buyer understands that they might need to write a check for 10,000 to this particular agent, they might pick up the phone and see if there's someone that's willing to do it for 9,000 or 8,000 or 7,000 or 5,000. We're going to see that. We're already seeing that.
And
in
that's
addition
like,
to that,
that's like everything. Why would
in addition to that, you're going to start seeing agents change their form of compensation. They never had to, remember, because who negotiated for them? This listing agent. So you're going to see buyer agents, I think, clearly start going into hourly rates, flat fees, those types of things. It just makes sense. If you bring any competition into an environment, you will always have alternatives and price compression. And not only will you have price compression, you might have better. I think you're going to get better services. I'm of the belief that, I don't know what's going to happen with ultimately buyer commissions. I mean, I have an opinion, of course, but I believe that the byproduct is I think that service is going to go up because you're going to have competition not only on commission, you're going to have competition on services. You're going to have competition on value, and that competition always makes the strong stronger. Sometimes it makes the weak stronger, but sometimes it makes the weak weaker, right? And that's what we're probably looking at.
Well, one of the pitfalls that exist that we haven't mentioned, and one thing for agents to really stay away from, is the bad word steering. Where describe please what an agent should not do as far as showing.
Again, if it's being done correctly, there would be no steering, right? If my buyer agrees to pay me 2% and that's worth it for me, if a buyer agrees to pay me 3 or whatever it is, and I determine that that's my compensation, and the buyer's like, that the whole reason for this is to avoid steering, right? That's part of the purpose. Because if the compensation is understood by the buyer and the buyer agrees to pay it directly, there is no steering because the buyer agent's going to make that commission regardless of what house they buy. That's the point. That's part of what this is all about. But right now, part of the kind of the confusion is sellers are still able to offer compensation. So what that does is that opens the door for a certain type of agent to potentially bring their buyer to a property that gives them more compensation, right? So if they call 3 homes, home 1 is paying 3, home 2 is paying 2.5, home 3 is paying 2. The concept is that, could a buyer agent steer the buyer to the property that's paying the larger commission? And the answer is yes. And that's kind of why we're in this situation. That's why the Department of Justice, as I know very well aware, wants to remove that totally. They want to put the real estate industry in an environment where seller compensation to a buyer's agent doesn't exist. And if you completely remove that, if you take that out of the equation, now financial steering ends instantaneously, because now buyer agents will articulate their compensation to buyers. Sellers will articulate their compensation to listing agents to the listing side, and it'll be a completely separate world. It's decoupled thing, and that will end financial steering theoretically overnight.
And I think that's what agents should be doing today. The agents I work with at our firm are understanding that we're acting as though there is no decoupling, because at the very least, you're working with agents that understand your value, understand that you can get them a house. One of the value adds is that your offer will be heard and actually discussed. If you're a top surgeon, or I have great buddies who are super fantastic, wealthy lawyers, have no clue what real estate does. They found out they live somewhere. They don't know anything how it worked. And they realized that if they tried it alone, it would never work. And that I think is how people have to approach this. Agents have to approach this because the future is so uncertain. I have my own belief system that there will not be decoupling. There will be decoupling very, very soon. So why not get better at one of the requirements, such as having that agreement signed, demonstrating your
Yep.
value, actually getting
Yes.
paid, how to get paid. And I think that alternate means of payment is really going to be the thing. I think we're going to
Well,
quickly.
you have two other highways of of methodology from a buyer's perspective. There's something called dual agency, where a buyer can go directly to the listing agent. I know we haven't mentioned it, but that's one other method. Is the buyer, if they can't reconcile compensation with a buyer's agent, they could go to a listing agent. So what we don't know with certainty yet is how listing agents are going to handle compensation as dual agents.
Right.
We know, and I can report to you back, that there's many listing agents who they're earning their compensation from their seller. They're charging their seller a commission of whatever it is. And if a buyer comes to them directly, in many cases, they're not charging the buyer anything. It's zero to the buyer, or it's a much smaller number. I want someone to do an analysis on, when it comes to buyer, what's the buyer compensation when the listing agent's a dual agent? What's the compensation when the buyer agent is getting on their own? I'm telling you, it's going to be much less. So there's a lot of dual agents who are in a position to, work with that buyer in a dual agency situation for a much, much lower side. And, in some cases, zero. So if that's the case, the buyer has this option of going directly to the dual agent. And we can certainly unpack it another time. Everyone says, oh, that's a conflict of interest. It's a bad thing. Again, the consumer is the one that we have to, listen to. And a lot of consumers like dual agency. A lot of consumers like going directly to the listing agent. But there needs to be better training on dual agency. Agents have to be better at learning how to do these dual responsibilities. That's a process. But it's done in many, many cases anyway. You can't find a good listing agent who hasn't been on both sides of a transaction and did it very well. So that's one way in which a buyer can buy a house, is going directly to the listing agent. Another way the buyer can buy the house is they could have it submitted through their attorney, right? So lawyers are emerging as entities that can submit an offer on behalf of their client. And in many of those cases, the attorney might be charging a nominal fee. I mean, a lot of attorneys they charge a legal fee for their services to represent them as a buyer. We're seeing attorneys and title companies adding to their services. Well, if you want, I can submit the offer on your behalf for an additional fee of X. And in many of those cases, it's substantially below these traditional, 2 and 3% models. So this is what I think is going to happen in much more scale. It's happening now as we speak, just 6-7 months after this thing. The needle is moving slowly, but the needle is moving. And any buyer agent who thinks that, it's going to go back to the way it was, or nothing's going to change, or sellers are just going to continue to pay. I mean, by the way, Scott, even if the DOJ does not completely sever and decouple, it's still going to be I think, a challenging road for a buyer agent if they don't have a very, very good value proposition to put in front of their buyer.
Right. And I think the strongest ability that a buyer's agent can show a buyer is that of negotiation, to really represent their interests, because an individual buyer may have had no experience in their lifetime negotiating anything. And at least someone is here, a professional licensed in the market, many years of experience, may have a relationship.
Right.
Listing
But
agent.
again, as I said earlier, your skill as a negotiator is very contingent upon the circumstances of that seller. So I could be the greatest negotiator on the planet Earth and sit there and tell you all of my war stories of how wonderful of a negotiator I have been, but those circumstances may not apply, and we don't know. It's all unknown. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but when we say I'm a great negotiator, what does that mean? You're gonna stomp your fist and not agree, and it's very hard to articulate good negotiation on a situation that you don't know what you're facing. Every negotiation has to stand on its own. So, I mean, you could say things like, well, I'm fluid, I'm agreeable, I'm very smart, I know how to assess. There's only so much you can do, in my view. To me, a good negotiator is someone who's very good at articulating and those types of things. But I think that there are some other, real services that you can layer into the equation. For example, some of the ideas in terms of what I call value added benefits as a buyer's agent is you can offer services to the buyer, like maybe offering to do a title search on the property before you submit the offer. This way, it might unveil any type of liens or clouds that could alter the seller's ability to negotiate. So, trying to make properties a little bit more transparent could help you as a skilled buyer's agent. Another thing that a buyer agent should be doing is they should make sure that the buyer is fully committed for the mortgage, subject to the appraisal, before they submit offers. I mean, you can have buyers get run through what we call the LP or DU system, which basically make the buyer extremely strong. Like, don't submit your buyer who is pre-approved or pre-qualified. Really take them to a higher level of authentication before that might help them win the bid. There are things that buyers can do when it comes to tactics. There are negotiating tactics that you can do. For example, you could possibly make some or all of the deposit non-refundable as a tactic to win the bid. You can offer maybe some use and occupancy offerings, basically making it easy for the seller to have a very flexible closing date and rent back the property. You could basically talk to the buyer about maybe doing some rate lock strategy, basically, submitting the offer and telling the seller that my buyer's willing to lock the rate so they don't float out of qualifying for the mortgage as a way to make it more secure. So there are some kind of solutions that you can bring into the equation. We talked about the seller concession. A seller concession is a powerful tool, and forget the commission for a second, but you can use that seller concession to get certain buyer costs paid for. One of my most favorite ones is the interest rate buy down, right? Showing buyers how you could basically get a lower interest rate over time by getting the seller to pay to buy down the interest rate on the mortgage. I mean, this is another very good thing. Maybe part of that seller concession can go towards the buyer commission, but maybe the other part of it can go toward the rate buy down, so they can get a much lower payment over the next 15 or 30 years. So these are all tactics and solutions and ideas that kind of lean into what I call the value added side of the buyer agency relationship. And again, there's no short of creativity and ingenuity on that side. I've shared with you a few, but good buyer agents make that all part of their business model.
Right. And I think that that all falls within the penumbra of representation. Negotiation is, of course, within the representation. And I think that buyers, if and when they show their naivete in dealing with this transaction, may not get the right response or even recognition from a listing agent. Listing agent is a job, and they're going to say, listen, I'm dealing with this seller. We have a lot of people speaking to all day. If someone a buyer can't put together a cogent email, they could be, with fabulous salary and income and assets, and it may not be heard. And I think regarding your point, mortgage buy down, I mean, that's a mathematical formula. I think a buyer's agent could easily show that paying me X today, if I'm successful getting you that rate reduction, shoot, that would be in, 68 months, you're flat. And month 69, you're making money. So how could you not hire a buyer's agent? It's really good.
But that makes the assumption that the seller will pay it, right? We don't know this. We can certainly try, and it's a good tactic, but we don't know. But we can certainly attempt to. That's kind of the challenge, is that we can lay out all these tactics and ideas on the buy side, but we don't know if we're going to get it. We can ask, and the fact that we know it is an advantage. But that's kind of what it's all about. It's like with attorneys, right? What's the difference between a good and bad? I mean, every attorney has to then go to trial and win the case. So you don't know what's going to be meant on the other side. It's the same thing with a real estate transaction. You just don't really know what's going to be on the other side. But having the tactics, knowing the tactics. But the other component of this buyer agency relationship now is the exclusive or non-exclusive. This is, I think, going to emerge as a very big issue, because many of these agreements ask for the buyer to commit to a time period, right? So let's say a buyer meets a realtor, they've met each other, for the first time. They put this buyer agreement in front of them to go see a house. Well, one of the kind of nutty things is that inside of that compensation agreement is how long am I going to be your buyer's agent? And those are what we call an exclusive agreement. And I think we're going to see some real issues with that, because a buyer might have only known you for a couple of minutes, signs an exclusive for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically, puts them in a very tough position, because they're now in a contract, right? And how are they going to go work with another agent? So now let's say in 2 weeks, they want to go see a house, and that buyer agent who they're in an exclusive with isn't available. What is it? I can't buy a house this weekend because my real estate agent is in Mexico. So these are going to be, I think, things that buyers need to understand. And hopefully good videos like this and good realtors will let them listen. You've got this choice. And if you're going to, engage in a buyer in an exclusive agreement, you better be in a position to be able to serve them. And even if you are, I don't know if that's going to be, a buyer just may not want to, may want to go in another direction, but they're locked in. So these are things that are going to have to be clear. And I think that good buyer agents, when it comes to exclusivity, it's the same thing on the listing side to some degree. Now with a listing, it's different, because the realtor immediately starts marketing and doing things and spending money and investing and investing and investing. And that may not marinate for time. But on the buyer side, there's not a lot of marinating in it, right? The buyer agent isn't doing the same things as a listing agent to create this huge kind of invoice, right? That's yet to be collected on, especially in an environment where you have a lot of buyers that are looking for their own house. I think that what we're going to see is these exclusives live more on what we call off-market deals, where let's say a buyer's agent, if they want to get a buyer to sign an exclusive, and if you want to add to your buyer's agreement with your services, I'm going to go house hunting for you. I'm going to go look for off-market properties. To me, that's a different thing. That now you're talking about somebody who's engaging you to go knock on doors in a community, or go out there and start marketing and spending money as a realtor to go find a house for my client. That to me does, in my mind, at least logistically and logically, define a good reason for an exclusive situation for time. But, that aside, I think that that we're going to see that exclusive, and buyer agents really have to unpack that exclusivity very, very well. Because if you get the buyer to sign the exclusive and you don't deliver, now you're going to be in a tough situation, and you might end up being in a situation where again, we don't want disputes with consumers. So I think it's important.
Right. We're also, have to touch on the point of enforceability, where in the prior paradigm, there was your commission MLS written in stone on your computer screen. And then there were the arbitration clause between members of MLS, Coldwell Banker and Century 21, really never stiffed each other. Well, now you're dealing with someone who's not an institutional entity. Your client, your buyer, could be anybody off the street. So now, not only does a buyer's agent have no guarantee or promise of what the commission will be, they have no guarantee or promise of actually getting it at closing. So what's your advice to an agent?
Well, what do you mean that they have no guarantee? If the agreement was signed and the buyer agreed to pay it, I mean, you have the same protections to some degree as the listing agent. I mean, the transaction can be held up
at closing without the guaranteed funds, and it does not go through the title company.
Oh, yeah.
We're now dealing just like you deal with your painting.
Yeah.
Or your car detailer, you don't, I mean, there could be, and also we're talking about a lot of money, and we're talking about a first-time experience. They've never, they may have, as you heard, big eyes. They didn't buy the boat, but they have a buyer's agent. So
again, I think it's too early to tell. I mean, if the buyer says they're going to pay the money and they show up and there's no money and they don't do it, what's going to happen? I mean, those are, I think, rare in nature. But to me, it's not about that per se, Scott. It's more just about the clarity up front. It's in some markets we are still seeing multiple offers. In a lot of markets, we're not seeing that the same way. But I think it's just about the clarity up front. And remember this, as much as what this policy is from a buyer's agency perspective, this is an emotional issue as well for realtors. It's an emotional issue for agents because for so long, for decades, it was one way, right? It was in fact, in many cases, there was almost an entitlement that the seller should pay it. I've heard in many circles, that, especially since this policy changed, a lot of realtors have said, well, why are sellers, sellers should pay it. They've got so much equity. There's so much equity there. They don't, they've paid it. They're not worried about paying it. They're doing it. Why do we have all this stuff? And, so just because something was the way it was, doesn't mean that's the way it should be, right? I mean, we can think of a lot of bad things that existed for years that you can't just, that's the way it always been. It worked, why change it? What we're talking about here is buyer and seller money, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if the listing agent no longer is negotiating for a buyer agent's compensation, so now a seller only has to make a decision on compensation with their listing agent, right? They don't have to get into who the buyer agent is. We don't know. I mean, why agree to a fixed number for a buyer's agent? We don't even know what the deal is. So from a seller's perspective, in theory, commissions, should be less to them, so that's a good thing, right? In theory, right? On the buyer side, if, the buyer agent has to articulate their value and the buyer has to agree with, that's a good thing, right? This is a very, very good thing for consumers. The industry, has fought that. They said it's going to be bad for consumers because buyers aren't going to be able to afford to pay a buyer commission. Well, that makes one giant assumption, that buyer commissions are going to continue to be there, right? I mean, if buyer agents start working for lower commissions, it could be good for buyers, right? If listing agents in cases don't charge buyer commissions, well, that could be good for buyers. So the prediction that it's unaffordable to buyers makes an assumption. It's almost like an arrogant assumption that everyone's going to keep their commission at this too. It's just not the case. So we know that the good thing behind this is choice and transparency. The good buyer agent won't run from it. They'll embrace it, and they'll give these buyers clarity on what the value proposition is and what their value add is. And if the buyer doesn't think you're worth it, if the buyer won't sign the agreement because they don't want to pay you, it's not that they don't want to pay you, it's that they don't see the value, right? You can't get upset at somebody who doesn't want to pay you because they don't think you're worth it. It's our job to make them think we're worth it, right? There's no, but this is this emotional component of the business. And, I think that each week, I think the needle continues to move. So the buyer agent needs to really, really perfect their presentation skills, right? Listing agents are already good at this, doing listing presentations. Well, buyers need to do buyer presentations. And I would bet I could walk into any real estate office in New York, in New Jersey, in Florida, in Oklahoma, walk in as a buyer. And I would say right now, as we speak, at the end of February of 2025, maybe 1% of the agents will bring me in the conference room, open up a laptop, and give me a full A to C buyer presentation on why I should hire that realtor and pay a commission of X. So that's the opportunity. You got to, if you could do that, I think you'll win. You'll win some clients.
I agree. I mean, that's necessary to remain compliant, which is going to be a fact going forward. We also, as realtors, have to stay compliant because we do not know if our actions that demonstrate a lack of compliance could give rise to a plaintiff's that still exist. We're members of a settlement. This case didn't go away. If ever there's any attempt to enforce the agreement and there's no ability to fly right, this whole agreement could be voided. And then we don't know the status of NAR. We don't know if there would be a complete decoupling with the court's injunction. We could be going back to almost some kind of a early Stone Age if we're not careful. So that's a big impetus as well.
Yeah, again, I think that it's hard to predict. I mean, I think if we just live in the environment that we're in right now, there's enough change, But if you just sit back and if I think anybody could just sit on the sideline, take the emotion out of the equation, and just look at logics. There's this narrative that's being promoted in the industry in many extents that says, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if you don't offer a commission, you're not going to get top dollar. If you don't offer commission, agents aren't going to bring their buyers. If you don't, there's this, if you don't pay a commission, something bad is going to happen thing going on. And I think that's just that's a fleeting argument. And it's not even a true argument, but, people believe it like the sky is blue because, so many times, I mean, let's face it, buyers shop for homes. They don't shop for agents. And if a buyer wants to see a home, and for some nefarious reason, a buyer agent doesn't show them the home, do we really think in this universe that the buyer isn't going to see that home? They'll find somebody else. They'll go to the listing agent. They'll call their attorney. They'll drive on their own. They'll go knock on the door themselves. I mean, there are just endless stories out there right now where buyers are being blocked from seeing homes or being steered away for whatever the reason is. And they're circling back around and speaking to the listing agent or the seller only to find out that the house was available and there was nothing bad. And I don't get it. And my realtor, whatever. It's unsustainable to act as a buyer's agent that way long term. There are many doing it. There are brokers that are doing it. But it's unsustainable,
Yeah, I love that you said that. Well, that's why this type of training is necessary. I believe that buyer's agents, to some or maybe a large extent, are here to stay. I know you have your opinions. I think
I think buyer agency will remain. It'll just be in a different form.
As needed. Okay, Scott, I agree with a lot. Thank you so much. We're here to make buyer's agents stay viable and prosper in this new policy environment. I think you've given a lot of great insight.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott, and appreciate it. And keep bringing the information to those that need it. It's a pleasure to be one of your resources.
Yes, sir.